G'day humans! Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. It's been one of the most dangerous, thorniest, most hazardous subjects to broach for the past 5 years, really. The question of whether we can have conversations about women's-only spaces, women's-only prisons, women's-only rape crisis centres, women's-only athletics carnivals, without raising the question of what exactly is a woman. In many political campaigns, it's even been a gotcha question that some journalists have posed to unwitting politicians. Can you define a woman? A question that would have seemed banal 10 years ago has been up and down and in and out and so topsy-turvy it leaves your head spinning. Where are we on these wars between transgender activists, women's rights activists, frequently known as transgender exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs, and the gay rights movement? Robert Wintemute is a world expert in this field. He's a gay gentleman himself who started out as a human rights campaigner on behalf of transgender people and was fundamental in one of the founding documents about transgender rights around the world, and has since modified his thinking somewhat, earning him the ire of some trans activists. And this year, a few months ago, New South Wales, the state where I live, the most populous state in Australia, enacted a law, the Equality Legislation Amendment, LGBTIQA+ Act 2024, although it came into effect in 2025, which now allows people in my state, in Sydney, to change their registered sex without undergoing any surgery, introduces non-binary as a recognised descriptor, and basically is just a self-reporting. A woman in New South Wales is somebody who fills out a form saying that they are a woman and nothing more. So if you thought that the transphobic extremes of Trump and Elon had set back the trans rights movement, it's worth noting that legislatures and courts take a long time to catch up, and many of the most extreme trans ideas from 2020 and 2021 are only now being enacted as the law of the land across many jurisdictions in the West. Robert Wintemute, today's guest, has written a new book about this. It's entitled Transgender Rights versus Women's Rights, From Conflict to Coexistence. He is a professor of human rights law at King's College London and has been for more than 30 years. He got his doctorate of philosophy from Oxford in 1993. And I started by asking Robert why culture has created so many areas in which we need to define ourselves as men and women on this narrow binary in the first place. I hope you enjoy as much as I did the one and only Robert Wintemute.
What has changed over time is the significance of being a woman. I mean, for centuries, it affected your legal rights. There was a time when women couldn't vote, when women were excluded from certain professions. So those distinctions were never justifiable and have disappeared. But we still have women's and men's toilets and changing rooms and prisons. And that's when your sex matters.
Right. And in some cases, we have quotas for women to try to ensure that they're properly represented on corporate boards or in parliaments or whatever it might be.
Yes. And that was an issue in the UK Supreme Court case. In fact, when I was watching the video of the hearing, I noticed one of the women judges on the court asked, so a man can transition from male to female at the age of 50 and claim to represent women, having had a life experience mainly as a man. So that was clearly one of their considerations.
And what do you say to the riposte to that, which is that that person isn't a man? They may be biologically male, but they've always been a woman who was born into the wrong body.
Well, I don't, so many people say no one is born in the wrong body. Every person gets one body. No one chooses their sex. And some people have strong feelings, beliefs, thoughts that they're a person of the opposite sex, but that has no effect on their biological reality. So, I mean, someone may identify as a woman, believe they're a woman, but they're not a woman. Changing your clothes does not make you a woman. Changing your birth certificate does not. And taking female hormones or having surgery does not.
But that obviously sounds, I suppose like that lands for many people as if it's on the wrong side of history, given the attempts that have been made to accommodate the minority of people. We're talking here about what would traditionally be called transsexuals, not people who I don't know, have some social contagion whereby they decide to start being playful with their gender later in life. But we're talking about that minority of people who, from a very, very early age, persistently insist that they are in the wrong body, and it seems that the only way they can lead flourishing lives is to facilitate that. It lands as being regressive for them to articulate biology that way, that deterministically.
Well, I explain this all in my book, Transgender Rights versus Women's Rights. So I went back to square one and asked, why did any country ever allow change of legal sex? Sweden appears to have been the first country in Europe in 1972. And I concluded that they took the wrong fork in the road. So they were dealing with a male to female transgender person who had had full surgery, who went to them and said, here, I've done the best I can to resemble a woman. I have difficulty in life because people see my documents say I'm male. Please change my documents to female to make my life easier. And that was the sympathetic response. Of course, we'll help you. And then later they said, okay, now I want documents changed with no medical treatment. So you, Josh, under the law of the UK and New South Wales and many states in the US, can be legally female with a beard and male genitals. And in the UK, that was introduced with some safeguards. You had to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And then the demand became self-identification. You just fill out a form and now you're a woman. Okay, so if the Swedish parliament had known that this was where this would lead, I don't think they would have changed the law back then. What was the other fork in the road? Protection for transgender people against all forms of violence, harassment, and discrimination, triggered because their appearance does not match what people expect for a person of their birth sex. And I think that is the best approach. So we have nearly 60% of countries in the world do not allow change of legal sex. Around 17 states in the US do not allow it.
Right, but those 60 countries and those 17 states are probably not places where progressively minded, small L liberal people want to live. They're probably fairly regressive. The case of the pro-trans person is a case that says we are bigger than the petty deterministic mandates of our birth, and we can treat each other in a more compassionate way by sort of honoring the internal preferences of each person, regardless of whether they align with a strict interpretation of biology.
I'm sorry, but honoring internal preferences has created a mess, and I have to be honest with it. I'm just country blank that's just been sitting on the sidelines. I don't know if they're regressive, progressive, whatever. I would say to them, don't start down this road. Do not change legal sex, but protect transgender people. And I think that is really what every country should be doing.
And if in the cases where you need a gender recognition certificate, how do you get a gender recognition certificate?
In the UK?
Yeah.
You have to apply for it. You need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And you need to show that you have lived in what they call the acquired gender for 2 years. Now, that is not defined in the Act. I don't know if a person born male who maintains a beard would be seen as living as a woman, but there are no formal requirements, whether you need to change your name or your clothing, hairstyle, etc.
And sorry, after the Supreme Court decision, does such a person qualify as the opposite sex, as their new sex, or no?
Not under the Equality Act 2010. And this applies to sports, single-sex spaces, etc. Quotas That was the specific issue in the For Women Scotland case. One issue that came up was associations of lesbian women. So lesbian women might like to have a lesbian speed dating event, and a person comes along who is legally female but has male genitals. It was unclear before the decision whether that person could be excluded. Now it is clear that they can be excluded even if they have a gender recognition certificate. So this is again why I get to this question: why change legal sex at all? When sex doesn't, your birth sex, your biological sex, it doesn't matter, it makes no difference. When your birth sex does matter, it makes no difference.
As a professor of human rights law, has your view changed on this?
Most definitely. I've been working in this area for 40 years. In 1985, I was the first openly gay lawyer at the Millbank law firm in New York, having studied law in Canada. And so I moved to the UK, did a PhD at the University of Oxford. And in the late 90s, I witnessed the formation of the LGBT political coalition. And I would say at the time, I didn't really see what the two groups had in common. But the coalition formed, and I just went along with it for many years. And I think there's a tendency to defer to what transgender people say. A non-transgender person doesn't really understand what it's like to be transgender, the challenges that this person might face. And so if they say, we need something, you tend to say, okay. And you don't really question it, especially if you're a man. And so I just went along with this for many, many years until in 2018, I had what I call my lightbulb moment. I was teaching in a summer school, and I was asked about an exception in UK law, which still exists. So originally, you couldn't change your legal sex at all. Then you could change your legal sex, but not if you were married. If you were married, you had to get a divorce first, because otherwise your marriage would become a same-sex marriage. Then in 2013, the law was changed for England and Wales, so you could have a same-sex marriage. So then you could change your legal sex if you were married, but only with the consent of your spouse. And in the transgender rights movement, they call this the spousal veto, and they consider it a terrible injustice. So I was asked about this in the summer school, and I just tried to explain it. In human rights law, we have a concept known as the rights of others, which appears in the European Convention on Human Rights. Sometimes your right to do something can justifiably be limited because it affects the rights of other people. So in this case, generally you'd have a person born male wanting to change their legal sex to female, and the wife has a strong objection. The wife says, well, actually, I entered into an opposite-sex marriage, and you are unilaterally trying to convert it into a same-sex marriage. The wife might have a strong religious objection. So I said, well, that's why the law has this exception. So either you get your wife to agree, or you have to get a divorce first, and then you change your legal sex. So there was a transgender student in the classroom who strongly objected to this. How could I compare the fundamental right of the transgender person to change their legal sex with a contract? So the marriage was dismissed as irrelevant. I explained the concept of the rights of others. What I didn't say at the time, but I could have, is that your right to marry is actually a fundamental right, except if you're already married to someone else. You have to get a divorce, tidy up your affairs before you can exercise your fundamental right to marry. So it's the same kind of situation. But the transgender student was not having it. And at one point I was feeling frustrated, and I said, trans rights don't trump everything else. and the student became angry and got up and left the classroom. And the light bulb moment was that this transgender student did not seem to understand that women have human rights too, and that sometimes they're in conflict with transgender rights and a balance needs to be struck. And so after that, I started speaking to women about their concerns. In 2020, I read the Yogyakarta Principles, Principle 31, saying that every country in the world must take sex off birth certificates. And I thought that was outrageous.
What was that? What was the Yogyakarta set of principles?
It's what you might call a civil society document. Some human rights organizations got together in 2006 in the city of Yogyakarta in Java in Indonesia, and published an interpretation of what human rights law requires for LGBT people, international human rights law. And the first version was published in 2007. They did a second version in 2017, which was more radical, and that included this Principle 31, take sex off birth certificates. So that actually shocked me, and I was interviewed about the Yogyakarta Principles. I'm considered a kind of founding father because I was one of the experts that attended the first meeting.
Were you there in Indonesia?
Indonesia, yeah. And so people kept asking me, were these conflicts between transgender rights and women's rights discussed in Yogyakarta? And I had to say no, they never came up. And as I said before...
Why was that, Robert? Was that because of cowardice or oversight?
I would say oversight. There were two transgender experts in the room. They said what they needed, and no one objected. I didn't object. As I said before, I deferred to transgender people. And none of the women in the room raised any objections. So, I mean, it didn't have a serious effect on the first version. It just said, it took the UK law, the Gender Recognition Act 2004, and said, this is the minimum standard for the entire world. So you cannot require any form of medical treatment. But it did not say what
you cannot require a person to undertake medical treatment in order to affirm themselves as
change their legal sex. Yeah, right. So no hormones or surgery. But what it didn't say was what you could require. So the UK's diagnosis of gender dysphoria was not mentioned. And then when they did the second version in 2017, I did not participate in that version. They introduced this Principle 31, which says every country in the world must remove, as a requirement of international human rights law, sex from birth certificates. And until that is done, change of legal sex must be allowed with no psychological diagnosis. So it says the UK law is not permitted anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me that are we getting hung up, not in this conversation, but in culture and society, about whether or not sex... It strikes me that we could save a lot of time and hassle by just reducing the focus on sex in the first place. In other words, a lot of trans people who I know say, yeah, I don't need to go to, the prison of the, I'm hoping not to go to prison, but if I have to go to prison, I don't need to go to a prison for the sex that I identify as. I don't need to play in sports. I don't need to go to a women's shelter if I was born a biological male. But I do resent moving through the world with people constantly raising their eyebrows about who I am and about my right to identify as the way that I want to, every time I have to cross a border and hand a passport to a customs agent who asks me intrusive and invasive questions about why I don't quite pass as a woman because there's an F on my passport. And if there was just no F on my passport, then the vast majority of occasions that make us feel discriminated against would evaporate. What do you make of that? And some part of me thinks that it's just more parsimonious to meet them halfway and turn the volume down on sex altogether.
Well, first of all, I would say that not many people in the transgender rights movement make the distinction that you've just mentioned.
The transgender
That
rights movement, though, is probably different from transgender people, right? Like all activists, like all activist groups are more extreme than the people they claim to represent.
that is probably true. But the people talking to the governments and the legislatures are the activists, and they don't make that distinction at all. That all I need is a passport. I don't need anything else. Their position is generally trans women are women in all circumstances. So in California, a person who identifies as a person born male with male genitals who identifies as female has a right to go to a prison for women. And you have the ongoing disputes about sports competitions, et cetera, et cetera. So in most people, I would say in the transgender rights movement do not accept any exceptions. So a trans woman is a woman for all purposes. Now, going back to the passport, the solution I would propose is to train people inspecting these documents just to look at the photograph. So, does the person in front of you match the photograph? If they do, no problem. So, society has to get used to different appearances and not expect that because it says M that that the person should look like you, Josh. The person could be a combination. They could have some stubble, some lipstick, earrings, shoulder length hair, a dress, and it says M, and that's okay. And actually, I've been advocating for the clear right of everyone to dress how they want since 1997. And an article I published then was cited by the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal in 2020. They had a case of a man going into prison, a man with shoulder length hair. He was told, you have to have it cut short. And a woman going into prison with shoulder length hair could keep it as it was. And the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal agreed this is sex discrimination. That's the way it should be all over the world, really. So just if the photograph matches, that's enough.
Right. And you mentioned that you heard from women during the period of your change of heart. How, in your estimation, has the feminist movement been split on this? Because my last job was at the public broadcaster in Australia. Most of my colleagues were very talented female producers, and occasionally this would come up. There was a snafu over whether or not a trans woman could use a women's only bathing space at one of the beach pools that we have in Sydney. And my female producers were of the opinion, just live and let live. Stop, just don't focus on it too much. Like, it doesn't bother us. It's, if there's leery behavior, if there's, offensive or intrusive or invasive behavior, then address that behavior. But, we're not going to go to the mat on the question of whether or not, exactly what junk someone has in their underwear if they want to use the women's pool. Like, the gist of it being a women's pool is sufficient for us. The environment, the generalized environment of feeling that you're surrounded almost exclusively by biological women, and certainly exclusively by people who carry a feminist flag, is enough. That's clearly not the perspective of people like Germaine Greer, or, we know the people who copped a huge the Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, the people who took a lot of fire over the past 10 years for standing up and being accused of being trans exclusionary radical feminists. But how did you notice that cleavage?
It tends to be generational. You tend to find younger women wanting to be progressive. I can give you an example of a discussion with a very liberal younger woman, probably under 40 at the time, in London. We were talking about the scenario that I would put to your former female colleagues at the public broadcaster. I'll just pause here for a second. As I said before, the issue is asymmetrical. It doesn't affect men at all. So if a person born female identifying as male wants to go into men-only spaces, men don't really care.
Well, can I just pause on that? I mean, if there was a men's support group, right? If there was what we would call in Australia a men's shed, where guys come together to talk about bloke stuff and air their issues, and there was a trans man, I could imagine that coming up.
It might, and there are some situations where someone might object, but I'm just saying, on the whole, there's certainly no fear of being, much less fear of being physically overpowered,
right?
etc.
Sure.
Yeah. So in that sense, it's asymmetrical. But even on the women's side, it's mostly a hypothetical question, and I'd say so. Most women will never go to prison. Most women do not compete in competitive sports. And most women have never seen male genitals in a changing room. But so that's the scenario you have to imagine. So going back to my liberal female friend in London, that's the scenario we were discussing. Okay, you're in a communal women's shower room, and there's a person with male genitals standing there. So my liberal friend was bending over backwards to be progressive and said, well, isn't this just like race? Isn't this like a white woman saying she doesn't want a black woman in the shower room? And I had to say, no, sex is not like race. We don't have, fortunately, no longer any different changing rooms and toilets for people of different races. We do have them for people of different sexes for good reasons. So, in London, I know a lesbian woman, a member of what was originally founded as a lesbian and gay swim club, was in the women's changing room and before one of the sessions of the club, and saw standing next to her a person with male genitals, and objected to this. She was told that she was transphobic. She cited the Equality Act 2010 exceptions on single-sex spaces and services, and she was told by the club that the law was transphobic. She was sent to mediation, and eventually she left the club. And since the UK Supreme Court judgment in April, she suggested to me that maybe the club owes her an apology because she was right all along. So, so that's, if you're really going to take this extreme position, you have to apply it to communal shower rooms, to prison cells, and to sports.
Can I just push on this analogy about race and the claim that they're non-analogous, like to be as generous as possible to the countervailing argument of the young woman you were speaking to? There have been times and places when there was a very justifiable fear, probably, of white people being victim of, I don't know, violence from black people. I mean, if you were in apartheid South Africa, it was probably very likely that an average black person was poorer and maybe had a higher rates of incarceration and criminality than the white elite. So it's conceivable that at the time it would have seemed sensible to isolate communities. Is there not an analogy there that the trans community is a historically disadvantaged community and is being excluded from that scenario in the changing room, and that there could be a future in 50 years or 100 years' time when we regard that as being equally retrograde? Not that there's no difference. There is a difference between a person with male genitals and a person with female genitals. But there's also a difference between a black person and a white person. We might just in the future say those are sort of trivial differences in comparison to the way that we want to express ourselves and express our gender identity.
Well, this argument has been made. I can refer you to a book published by a transgender person, Martine Rothblatt, The Apartheid of Sex, published in 1995. I read it in 1996. I liked the part about same-sex marriage. I thought, oh, great, this is good stuff, and kind of skimmed over the rest. I didn't really process it. In 2023, I went back and reread the book and was absolutely shocked. It said, yes, sex should be taken off birth certificates. It should be treated like race. And there should be no single-sex spaces. One set of prisons for all, with mandatory contraceptive injections to prevent pregnancies, one set of sports categories, etc. So I think for most women, a nightmare scenario. So that's, and I just historically, if you go back to 1954, U.S. Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Education, which was it was specifically about racial segregation in public schools, but it was applied across the board to public toilets, drinking fountains, etc. And at no point did anyone say, well, we should apply this to male and female spaces as well. Not in 1954 and not today. They are most definitely different.
Are there as many trade-offs between women's rights and transgender rights as we are told from both sides, from either the extreme transgender activists or from the conservatives who would previously have been called TERFs? Like, what is the most harmonious way of resolving whatever conflicts there are? And are any of the conflicts phony?
Well, there are fewer conflicts than you think. For example, violence. Nobody is proposing that transgender people should be subjected to violence or not protected against violence. Now, this came up at McGill University, Montreal, January 2023, when I gave a talk. There was an open letter to McGill University calling for the cancellation of my talk because it would promote the genocide of transgender people around the world. Okay. Just saying the things I've been saying to you would cause genocide. Okay. So that is just absurd. Employment discrimination. Nobody calls for employment discrimination against transgender people in the vast majority of situations where your birth sex is not relevant. So employment discrimination against transgender people has been illegal in the European Union since 1996 and under U.S. federal law since a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2020. And no one is debating that. So in this chapter, Common Ground, I just go through quite a wide array of rights that are not contested. So what is contested? First of all, changing your legal sex and how easy it should be. Second, the exceptions that are necessary if you have changed your legal sex. And third, the issue we haven't discussed so far, medical treatment of minors with gender dysphoria. Those are the big issues.
Yeah, we'll get there in a second. I just will also, before we leave adults, want to get clarify what the status quo of the law is in places like the state where I live in Australia, because we just passed this law that said what exactly, and in what company does it put us in terms of other jurisdictions?
It's pretty much the self-identification model has been adopted in New South Wales. New South Wales has gone from a law requiring surgery to one requiring a statement of support from someone who's known you for 12 months that you're acting in good faith. And that is all.
Does that person have to be a justice of the peace or something, or they just have to be anybody?
Someone who's known you for 12 months.
So you just need one person in the world.
Yeah. And most people could come up with that person. So
I'm pretty sure anyone could come up with one human being in the world who would vouch for them. They've known for 12 months.
So you could call that a safeguard. It doesn't exist in Ireland, for example, or Argentina, but not much of one. So I'd just like to comment on this bill because I read it. I read the first version of the bill, which said that the individual applying to change their legal sex could nominate a sex descriptor, any sex descriptor of their choice, if it was not a prohibited one, which included offensive or obscene words. Okay, so when I read this,
what's a sex descriptor? What does that mean?
Male, female, or something else. So for the something else, in the first version of bill, you could put whatever you wanted. So the question I asked, I was going to put this in my book, but eventually I didn't. So could you put kangaroo or koala?
Right.
Yeah. And in the first version of the bill, I couldn't see anything to prevent that. So I just discovered on Well, really, over the weekend, that the bill has become law and has come into force on the 1st of July. But it was watered down somewhat in negotiations between the member of the Legislative Assembly and the Labour government in New South Wales. So now it says you can change your sex on your birth certificate, and the choices are male, female, non-binary, non-specified, or something else provided by regulations. So far, I can't find any regulations to give you other options. So now it's 4. But I saw a discussion on Australian television about the fact that the new law says you can change your sex as many times as you want. In the UK, it's once, when a condition of changing a legal sex is that you're going to live with this new legal sex for the rest of your life. In Australia, no limits. So presumably in the winter, you could be male, spring female, summer non-binary, autumn non-specified, and then continue the cycle.
And this would literally open you up to all of the benefits of the opposite sex, if there are any under the law. Like, this isn't just a game that people can play, but like, I would literally be able to change my sex and then be able to fulfill a quota in a political party that might have them, for example. Like, is there any other safeguard? Is there any common sense safeguard where the rubber actually meets the road to, I don't know, soften the impact?
A very good question. And so this morning I checked the law. It says, so a person who has changed their legal sex is, for the purposes of any law in New South Wales, a person of the sex stated in the certificate, but this is subject to any other act. So other acts can override this. I checked, there's an exception for transgender participation in sports. And the new act that has come into force in 1st of July has a note. It says, nothing in this part changes access to toilets, change rooms, sport, or allocation in correctional facilities, women's refuges, or any other place. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So if there was a rule that, tried to encourage greater female participation in the arts, and, there was a funding body or something that would provide $10,000 in startup cash to get women into, I don't know, unscripted television production or something like that, I could change my sex tomorrow and get that grant.
Possibly. It depends whether they thought about this scenario and wrote in an exception. Often nobody thinks about it, so there's no exception there.
They couldn't do it ad hoc, because then they'd be in breach of anti-discrimination law, because they'd be discriminating against me as a trans person, presumably.
Quite possibly. So that's why you need to anticipate and write in an exception. But I can cite 2 examples. So I grew up in the province of Alberta in Canada, which is known as the country's most conservative province. So I was very surprised when I learned that Alberta has self-identification and had it before New South Wales. And a man, it's reported, you can find this in various websites, BBC, etc. A man changed his legal sex to female to get cheaper car insurance. And
yeah, right.
Yeah, so there's
a
good reason.
We have to pay more for car insurance because we're less drivers.
Yeah. Now that is sex discrimination. Because every individual should be judged on their own driving record. If you're a safe male driver, age 20, you shouldn't be charged more. And that is the law in the European Union. There was an exception for insurance premiums, and it was struck down by the Court of Justice of the EU in 2011. That's the solution, not changing your legal sex. There was another case in Switzerland, actually. Switzerland adopted self-identification in December 2020 on the same day as same-sex marriage. So this is a characteristic of these political changes. They're done under the cover of same-sex marriage. The public is distracted, or there's just no time for public debate or discussion. So the New South Wales law, most of the stages in the Parliament took place in less than 48 hours in October 2024. So, so in Switzerland, which has self-identification, a man changed his legal sex to female to avoid compulsory military service. And presumably there was no exception for this.
I mean, another way, you mentioned that they often come through with same-sex marriage. It's not just that there's a technocratic or logistical connection between these laws and same-sex rights laws, but also I think culturally they've done a good job, the trans activists, of piggybacking on the rhetoric and intuitions of gay rights equality. Here there was a long conversation in New South Wales about conversion therapy. In the case of gay kids, they would try to have the gay beaten out of them or, discouraged out of them, usually by religious bigots. And that there's a long and terrible history of that. And then that analogy gets used in the case of the transgender issue to demonize psychiatrists who are trying to investigate what else is going on with a child who is presenting with gender dysphoria, as if to ask questions about their overall mental health or possible depression or anxiety or autism or whatever it might be is a form of conversion therapy, because you're refusing to a priori honor their gender identity and ostensibly trying to discourage them out of it or something. So I think there's a big cultural way in which a lot of this probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for the credibility that the success of the gay rights movement has been able to lend it.
Well, that's definitely true. And a real watershed was June 2015, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided that there was a right of same-sex couples to marry in all 50 states. So by 2015, you had same-sex marriage across the UK, across the US, in most of the UK, in Canada, in New Zealand, and ongoing debate in Australia. So you had LGBT rights organizations panicking. Most of their work was done. So how are they going to raise money? How are they going to justify funding? And so they took up transgender issues in a big way. In my book, I'm sorry to be so blunt, but I call it the hijacking of LGBT organizations by the transgender rights movement. And what this has meant is that no dissent is permitted. So I mentioned I started to be interviewed about the Yogyakarta principles as a person who was there at the start. And so a journalist contacted me. I said what I thought. This was published in the online magazine, The Critic, on the 1st of April, 2021. The next day, I got an email from the executive director of ILGA Europe, the International Lesbian and Gay Association European region based in Brussels, saying that this had serious implications. So I had done free legal work. This is pro bono work, doing what are called in the US amicus curiae, friend of the court briefs, in Europe, third-party interventions, for ILGA Europe for over 20 years. And only on lesbian and gay cases. I did not work on transgender cases. I said to them, let's agree to disagree. I don't work on transgender issues for you. I will be happy to continue working on the lesbian and gay cases. And 2 weeks later, I was told that it was now impossible to work with me. So the relationship of over 20 years was terminated because no dissent is permitted. So, and if a lesbian woman in one of these organizations says, well, actually, I don't think that a person born male retaining male genitals is a woman, then they would be silenced as well. So that's the situation.
Why do you think that strategy emerged, Robert? The cynical explanation is that they want funding in these groups, but there's something broader going on culturally from people who don't have such a crude vested interest. You mentioned the genocide accusation, that you got at McGill. I've had similar experiences where I've, pitched a panel conversation about this issue, and I'm told that, we don't countenance having conversations that call into question people's right to exist, for example. well, listen, I'm not calling into question people's right to exist. I'm calling into question. I'm calling for a conversation about a particular approach towards identity and towards the trade-offs of human rights. But it's like this is a very different strategy and a very different fever pitch than other civil rights movements. It doesn't smell of Gandhi. It doesn't smell of Martin Luther King. It doesn't smell of Nelson Mandela. It smells of something much more censorious. Do you have an explanation for why?
Yes, in fact, I can refer you to an excellent explanation which appeared on the 26th of June this year in the New York Times. It was the 10th anniversary of same-sex marriage across the U.S. Andrew Sullivan, the commentator, wrote a guest essay about the radicalization of the LGBT rights movement. And he contrasts the patient persuasion that required, in his case, you could say 26 years. So he wrote an essay calling for same-sex marriage in 1989, and success was achieved in 2015. And he went across the country debating, doing debates with people, trying to address their concerns, etc. In person by person persuasion was the tactic or the method of the LGBT rights movement. The transgender rights movement is an element of what you could call the woke social justice movement, which doesn't believe in persuasion. By the way, the transgender member of the House of Representatives in the U.S., Sarah McBride, has commented on this recently, the failure to try to persuade. So it's basically, I would call it a quasi-religious approach, which is, that we're going to tell you the truth, and if you don't accept it, you're evil and should be silenced. So trans women are women. The Stonewall group or organization in the UK in 2018, they printed T-shirts, trans women are women, get over it. And when I was at McGill, there was a chant. The students were trying to drown me out from outside before they invaded the seminar room and stopped it. They were chanting, fuck your system, fuck your hate, trans rights aren't up for debate. And so that has been the approach. No debate, no discussion. And that is, I could say, a recipe for political backlash if you don't allow people to express their concerns. And that's why the transgender rights movement is now losing in court. They've lost in the UK Supreme Court in April and in the US Supreme Court in June in the case about medical treatment of minors with gender dysphoria. And at some point, I'd like to link that to the conversion therapy topic.
I promise. I just want to touch on that and sort of say that not only are trans rights losing in court, but they're also dragging down public support for gay marriage at the same time, which I just read in The Economist is at lows that we haven't seen in decades in the United States, particularly among Republicans. And one of the possible explanations is that, small c conservative middle Americans or middle Brits or middle Australians, as you might call them, are a bit fed up and put off by this whole thing and find it all a bit extreme. And one of those casualties is support for same-sex marriage. Let's talk about the allegation of conversion therapy, and let's talk about pediatrics, because this is probably the most contested and where the passions run the hottest. Where are we?
Well, I was asked to write a chapter for a book that's going to be published in France about conversion therapy. And I had to sit down and think about it for the first time. And the first question I asked myself is, how is this different from religion? So, particularly with regard to adults. So, in the European Court of Human Rights protects the right of the right to proselytize, to tell people that their religion is wrong or their absence of religion is wrong, and that your religion is the right one and they should change their minds. And that was my starting point. And so I was asking myself, so why is your sexual orientation so sacred? that no one can tell you you're making a mistake. So then I looked at the laws in the US, and there's a very interesting pattern. So the political polarization in the US means that you have blue states and red states. Blue states are good and do everything right. Red states are evil, and all of their ideas are bad. Okay. So in the blue states, medical treatment of minors with gender dysphoria is permitted. So this will mean puberty blockers, opposite sex hormones, and surgery. You get cases of girls who are 15, even 13, having their breasts removed.
Is that legal? I thought that the protocol was puberty blockers at those ages and surgery after the age of whatever, adulthood.
Well, it depends on the country. In the UK, the National Health Service does not offer any surgery for gender dysphoria until the person is 18. But those limits don't exist in many US states. So the blue state position is medical treatment is permitted at any age, but conversion therapy is prohibited. And having concluded, I couldn't see why you needed protection against conversion therapy for lesbian and gay adults, at least. If you don't want it, just say no. And if it's because you're in a religious community and you're being pressured to change, it's really difficult for the law to intervene, because how do you protect people from their own religious beliefs? Now, we had a big debate in the UK about sadomasochism in the 1990s, and the conclusion of the Law Commission was that you should be able to consent to it as an adult. But you have the same people who campaigned for the right to consent to sadomasochism now saying, no, you cannot consent to conversion therapy. If someone puts you in a chair and says, I think you're living your life the wrong way, no, that is abusive and something you shouldn't be able to consent to. And that just doesn't make sense to me. So,
right, but aren't we normally talking about minors in the case of conversion therapy? Aren't we normally talking about, 13-year-old boys who are being sent off to be yelled at by or manipulated by, religious brethren?
It depends on the country. So in Germany, it's only under 18s. The US states that prohibit it, it's only under 18s. But Canada, it's any age. France, it's any age. Some states in Australia. So it depends. But I would say the main incentive for a conversion therapy law is to prevent psychotherapy as an alternative to puberty blockers, opposite sex and hormones, especially in the case of a minor with gender dysphoria. So that is the main object of it. And so what has happened in the US, the question of laws prohibiting medical treatment of minors with gender dysphoria went to the US Supreme Court on the 18th of June. The majority, by a vote of 6-3, ruled that these laws are permitted. They have a rational basis. You have 24 states that prohibit all treatment of this kind. It's possible in future that more states will adopt these laws to protect young people, because they are essentially too young to make these choices. In England, a person under 18 cannot buy cigarettes or alcohol, cannot have a tattoo, and cannot have a Botox injection. But until recently, they could have puberty blockers, which might result in permanent changes to their body. So that is the concern. So the evil people of the red states, in fact, maybe they're onto something. The children need protection. And if you look at, so this red state, blue state debate in the US, if you go to the UK, we had a conservative government that banned, first the National Health Service stopped prescribing puberty blockers, and then the conservative government banned private prescriptions. When the Labour government won the election, they extended that ban and made it permanent. So we have a political consensus in the UK. It is not good blue state versus evil red state. So that's So that's the issue of laws banning medical treatment of minors with gender dysphoria. That's been settled in the US. It's up to each state to decide. But with conversion therapy, that issue is now before the US Supreme Court. So in a case from Colorado, a therapist who wants to offer psychotherapy to a person, a minor with gender dysphoria, is confronted with Colorado's law against conversion therapy. And the therapist is arguing that this is a violation of the right to freedom of expression. And so that probably by June next year, there'll be a judgment on that issue.
Can we not make a distinction between conversion therapy on the issue of sexuality and conversion therapy on the issue of gender identity? In the sense that, I mean, I can imagine a case being made that sexuality is quite well understood. It has a very long history of understanding what treatment does to people. It doesn't seem hugely open to social contagion. Kids are gay, even if they grow up in environments where it's terrible to be gay. There's obviously some kind of genetic or epigenetic, source of sexuality, and therefore it's unusually cruel to try to cajole someone to have a different sexuality than they believe that they do. But that the same kind of rigidity does not necessarily apply to gender identity, especially in cases where there might be a social contagion effect of a bunch of girls who are kind of gender queer and, on the autism spectrum or something, all coming out. And maybe you want to interrogate that as a psychiatrist or a psychologist more intently than would be appropriate to interrogate their sexuality. Are they not two different things?
I think there are, because there's really no evidence that any amount of psychotherapy will change someone's sexual orientation if they're same-sex attracted. So it really is pointless. But with regard to gender dysphoria, there was a lot of evidence before gender-affirming medical treatment was introduced that most young people with gender dysphoria changed their minds and decided, no, I can accept my body and I don't need any medical treatment. I can accept my sex. So that is a major point of contention between many lesbian and gay adults and transgender rights activists. I have a chapter in my book with the title, Why Transgender Rights Are Not Like LGBT Rights. And the major point of dispute is that many lesbian and gay adults can remember being feminine boys or masculine girls and being left alone to grow up and become happy lesbian and gay adults. And the statistics on children referred to gender clinics show that most of them, a large majority, are same-sex attracted. And so some people call this the medical treatment, the conversion therapy. And in fact, what they're doing is converting potential future lesbian and gay adults into future heterosexual adults. And sometimes they say that, I've heard, at least there's an expression in France about extreme positions sometimes meeting. So the ultra progressive position that children require medical treatment meets the position of the government of Iran. So in Iran, you can't have an open lesbian or gay relationship. But if you say you're transgender, they're quite happy to book you for surgery. So if you're a gay man attracted to men, you would be told, great, you need to change your body. As a woman, you can have relationships with men. So the position of many lesbian and gay adults now is leave the children alone, let them grow up, offer psychological support, and explore other causes of their mental distress. Is it autism, sexual abuse earlier as a child? What other causes there could be? But don't try to change their bodies.
Isn't the problem with leaving it alone in the case of a transsexual that puberty then cements the biology of their natal gender, and that there's then no way to get out of it. I mean, I feel like the cohort of people who we're talking about here is relevant, that we're being sloppy in the broader culture about the difference between this minority of people previously called transsexuals, who from the age of 2 insist that they're in the wrong body and who really do lead largely miserable lives if that's not accommodated, versus various concentric rings of populations of people who might have drunk some gender Kool-Aid and find it fulfilling in some way to express whatever other psychological issues they've got going on through identifying as non-binary or the opposite gender. Like, are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater here?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that, because most of this discussion about medical treatment concerns risks and benefits, and is there enough evidence? Have the treatments been studied, etc.? But I think there's a much bigger problem, which is, how do you know what this child will want when they're 18? Okay, the child says one thing now, I'm a boy, but actually I'm really a girl. Will they say the same when they're 18? Nobody can know that. That is why caution is required. Now, some will say, well, this is terrible for the truly transgender child, who will go through puberty, will have sex characteristics they don't want. But first of all, the past evidence shows that the majority will change their minds. We have to think about those children.
But when we say the majority will change their minds, aren't we talking about the larger cohort of all of those concentric circles of people who identify as trans? I don't think the majority of the inner cohort of true transsexuals changes their minds, do they?
Well, nobody knows who the true transsexuals are. And the past studies...
Fair point. But,
yeah, and the past studies showed that up to 80% of them changed their minds. So I can recommend the book by Hannah Barnes, Time to Think, about the gender clinic in London, the pediatric gender clinic. And she interviewed various people. One of them said that the children who were not truly transgender were treated as collateral damage. So in this zeal to help what was assumed to be the truly transgendered child, they were changing the bodies of children who might have changed their minds later if they had been left alone. So that's just the first big problem, is you don't know which children are the ones who will want this treatment when they're 18. I compared it in a draft document with cancer. So a child has cancer. We know that child has cancer. We know the situation is urgent. We treat them. Gender dysphoria, is it permanent or temporary? We don't know. So that's why, and the medical treatment is not urgent. So that's why we should not intervene. Now, the second reason...
Just to pause there before we get to the second reason.
Yeah.
Surely it's possible that we've been unduly sloppy in our zeal for trans equality and trans rights, and that there have been these tragic instances of detransitioning and overdiagnosis, and those instances of collateral damage should never have happened. And at the same time, if we were really diligent about using professional psychiatrists and psychotherapists to ascertain who are the ones who are the true transsexuals, almost with whatever biology they have or psychology they have, and who are the ones who are victims of contagion or something else going on, wouldn't you be able to... I mean, you sound fatalistic about it, like throwing your arms up and saying there's no way that we could possibly tell the difference. But surely people who've worked in this field forever would have a pretty good idea about the likelihood of this being a person who is going to live a life of quiet desperation if we don't give them puberty blockers, and this is another person who is probably in a category that is somewhat more fungible.
You might think that that possibility exists. Personally, I just think it's fallible, and my sympathies are with the misdiagnosed child. But it is said, and I had this conversation recently in the Netherlands, that that's where this treatment was first invented, gender affirming treatment. And they said, yes, we had rigorous psychological screening before we offered the treatment. Well, that rigor has been abandoned in most places in the world. It's now gender affirming treatment means a boy says he's a girl, and the reaction of the parents, the healthcare professionals, etc., is supposed to be, that is an absolute truth. You know who you are. We must get you medical treatment as soon as possible. And in the book, I mentioned Hannah Bard's Time to Think. The one defense of puberty blockers is it's merely pausing puberty, giving the child time to decide what they want to do. That is theoretically possible. But what she points out, in practice, no thinking takes place because there was no psychological support. It was just a medical conveyor belt. You're on puberty blockers, then you go to opposite sex hormones, then you go to surgery. And there was no reconsideration of whether this is the right treatment. So it's the uncertainty of which children would benefit from this in the long term, which is the reason why I oppose all medical treatment of minors with gender dysphoria. But there's a second reason. Even if you could be absolutely sure that this is a truly transgender child who will want this when they're an adult, there are benefits to going through puberty. Going through puberty means that you will have fertility, and in some cases it's necessary, according to a transgender surgeon, to have an orgasm. So this surgeon, Marcy Bowers, pointed out, she said, if you haven't had an orgasm before the medical treatment starts, you might never have one. Okay, so there's quite a trade-off there. Passing better as an adult, and this is more an issue in the male to female case. So yes, you might pass better as an adult, but you take risks with your fertility, with sexual pleasure as an adult, and even the surgery is more complicated. So if you take puberty blockers, you have the penis of a boy, which surgeons then have to try and turn into a vagina, and becomes more complicated. So, but my basic argument would be that...
Wait, sorry, how does the puberty blocker change the biology of the penis?
Because it doesn't grow.
Oh, I see. So you're an 18-year-old with a little boy's penis.
Yeah, so the surgery is normally turning an adult penis into a neo-vagina. But if you have a boy's penis, you have a lot less to work with. But I see. And
sorry, without getting too graphic, I do just want to understand this point. You're saying that the size of the penis actually then becomes consequential in terms of the creation of the vagina because the nerves and so on have to be in... Is that what you're saying?
There's less tissue to work with. I've read of one case where they had to take part of the intestine to add additional tissue. So, but I would say my main argument, even to the truly transgender person, assuming we could identify that person, would be, how can you know whether you can accept your post-puberty body, the only one you'll ever have, if you don't go through puberty? So now there was a comment in the New York Times about there being a value judgment that it's better not to be transgender. And I would limit it to taking hormones of the opposite sex for your entire life and risking side effects and having surgery that does not always go well and can have complications. So accepting the body you have, not taking hormones, not having surgery, is a better outcome than having that medical treatment, if possible. So that's why I think children should be protected until they're 18, and then they can make the decision whether they need to make permanent changes to their body. By the way, a topic for another day, I would make the same argument about male circumcision.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the difference in the case of circumcision would be that a child is still capable of understanding the general contours of what it means, presumably. I mean, we might differ about that, but in the case of losing the ability to have an orgasm, there's no way that a child can even understand what the conversation is. Like the stakes are impossible to comprehend, right? Because you feel completely different post-puberty than you do pre-puberty about the opposite sex or about, sexual attraction or about whatever. It's a totally different universe. You just have to look at a 15-year-old male, especially, to know how different that creature is from an 8-year-old. And so how can the 8-year-old make decisions about what the 15-year-old wants?
They can't. And sorry, what was I going to say? Yeah, I mean, in the past, the evidence showed that gender dysphoria often resolved itself after puberty. So that's why it's important to go through it. And
I want to let you go, Robert. And I also want to let myself go because I have to go and feed my kids. But it sounds to me like what you're saying from a human rights law and a moral perspective is not just that this is a clash between, trans rights and all other rights, or trans rights and female rights, or trans rights and children's rights, but that as a gay person, it was quite chilling to hear you make the point about effeminate boys and tomboy girls now sort of being, talk about, if you wanted to be as hyperbolic as the trans rights activists and talk about genocide, you could talk about a genocide of, effeminate little camp boys and masculine tomboy girls who are now growing up in a context in which that could be presumed to be evidence of them being the opposite sex. In other words, are you worried about there being a clash here between actually that LGBT is not just a strange mishmash, but a contradictory one, and that there's a basic conflict between gay rights and trans rights?
Definitely. And the talk I gave at McGill had the title "The Sex versus Gender Identity Debate in the UK and the Divorce of LGB from T." And what really attracted the almost 200 student protesters, what was the red flag for the bull, so to speak, was I mentioned that there's a new organization in the UK called LGB Alliance, of which it's a charity of which I'm a trustee. And so LGB Alliance generally supports transgender rights, but has particular disagreements about change of legal sex, women-only spaces, and medical treatment of children. And so that's why we take some distance from the transgender rights movement, because we need freedom to disagree. So the chant in the UK is no LGB without the T, or LGB with the T. My counter chant is LGB is not like T. Sometimes we might disagree. Okay. But in the LGBT community, this is considered high treason. Okay. So the LGBT Alliance was attacked from the moment of its birth by a transgender, or an organization for transgender children and adolescents called Mermaids, which went to court to try and have our charitable status revoked, even though they didn't have any legal standing to do so. And well over, let's say $300,000 or $400,000 was spent on legal fees, and they lost their case.
That's amazing. So, that is like, frankly, disgusting that any activist group that claims to be for people's rights would try to revoke try to discredit another group that is fighting for people's rights, for another group's rights, because it differs in opinion about certain trade-offs. Like, it's gross.
Yeah. And this is no debate. And I just went to an LGBT law event recently. Now I don't go to LGBT spaces. I don't feel welcome there. And I really felt, as I told people, like Charles Darwin at a creationist conference. So everyone there has these certain beliefs. Trans women are women. Medical treatment of minors is a good thing. It's just been banned in Argentina and Brazil. That's terrible. Rising transphobia. And I don't agree with this. And not a single person there mentioned my book. And they didn't want to talk about it.
And the weirdest and like most macabre thing about all this is that the greatest victims of this are trans people, and they're right to be worried about transphobia because it is on the rise, and it's caused by these people who are self-appointed activists who've just asked for so much more than the average person regards as being reasonable. And of course, there's going to be a backlash. I've been saying for 7 or 8 years, be careful. There's going to be a backlash to this.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just keep chanting and shutting people down and thinking that they're going to cop it indefinitely. It was obvious that we were going to get a backlash, and the people who pay the price for that, just as the people who pay the price for jihadists are everyday Muslims, are it's like we see this movie play out so many times. It's infuriating that it keeps on happening.
Yeah, anyway. I would just say there, the transgender rights movement has made some unreasonable demands that have triggered a political backlash. The question is whether they're willing to reassess their demands. And the problem is once you go out on the trans women are women limb, it's hard to go back. So I'm hoping that they will, and that they will honestly reassess their position.
I mean, it's not a big shift. It doesn't have to be a big shift. I know it feels big to the people who are all inside baseball, but to the rest of us who are on the outside, just instead of trans women are women, it's trans women are basically kind of women and should be treated as such in almost all circumstances, but not every single one. Well, that's not that bad, right?
No, not at all. And actually, I published an essay in the Quillette online magazine, and the final sentence was, transgender persons are human beings, and that should be enough.
I'll leave it on that. Robert, thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your insights. Also, if people are interested in Andrew Sullivan and the piece that he wrote in the New York Times, he was on this show last month, and he'll be another guest in a few weeks' time. He's an amazing person and well worth looking into for an early gay activist's point of view about what's gone wrong in the trans universe. As are you, Robert. Thank you again.
Thank you.